Yeah, good to see everybody's faces. How are you all doing? Yeah. I'm doing better after my wine tasting, I just have to say.
Yeah.
Sounds about right.
Yeah.
Cool. Well, it's a learning module week, so I have a learning module on story splitting. It's gonna be very exciting. It's a yeah, it was wild. Kind of once I got into it, I was like, oh, there's a lot to know here, and so there's a lot of content there. We may not, I don't know. I mean, we might go over it fairly quickly. It's pretty well, like in the slides, there's it's a lot of information, but anyway, we'll do that, and then maybe what we'll do is actually try it on a couple of stories, like the next couple of things. Just like look at the next, maybe 2 or 3 stories that are in the backlog, and talk about whether we think we need to split them up, and if we are going to split them up, how we would, like, what would we, kind of end up with in terms of smaller stories. So, but first, we'd love to see demos of any changes to the app since the last time we met.
Sure. Do you want me to go, Jen?
Yeah, that would be great. You can go
Okay.
first.
Yeah. Alrighty. So I'll start with the very brief demo of the actual in the app. So here's the iPhone version. Sorry, Jen, did you want me to also narrate?
Oh yeah, that would be good. Yeah, if you have anything that you'd want me to say too, I can chime in.
Okay, sure. Yeah, I mean there's not a whole lot. So here's the iPhone version. So our issue was to add an icon in the top right of the header. When you tap it, the modal shows up, and then there's also an X within the header that closes it. And then the modal itself just has a little settings header. So it's pretty straightforward. So we added the little gear icon here that was provided. So when you click that, the modal pops up. Here's the settings heading, and then there's the X. And when you click that, it shuts. So that's basically the bulk of what the changes that made. In the code, it was essentially 2 files plus some styling. So for the header, in terms of inserting the icon, we pretty much added it the same way that the center button was added like a week or 2 ago. So we have that very similar CSS to the other one. It's just aligned to the right as opposed to aligned to the left. And we created a use state that basically just toggled the state of the modal on and off. And so when you click the button, we passed it a arrow function that sets that to true. And then we also passed that down into the settings modal component, which I guess was kind of the bigger part of what we did with this, was creating that whole component.
I would say, like, it's interesting to see y'all use state for that. Use state for that, because like my instinct when I built the app was to use routes. So I had like a /settings route, and that, like, when it was that, it would render everything plus that additional component, the modal component. But this works totally fine as well.
Oh, cool. Yeah, I also saw something about kind of turning like CSS on and off. I did it this way in the contracting job I was at, so this was the one I was most familiar with. We actually originally were thinking about using Materialize, and then we just couldn't kind of wrap our head around that during our first call, so we just kind of reverted to...
Yeah, our Materialize modal, am I muted? No, okay. Our Materialize modal originally didn't, it kept throwing a few errors, and we were like, oh, this is pretty early on, we're just gonna cut our losses and just not use it. Just because it was like, we were going down the rabbit hole of like 40 minutes of like Googling things and why it wasn't working. And so Matthew kindly was like, well, I've made a modal before. I'll just attach the CSS. So.
Cool.
Yeah, and so that's pretty much the basis of it. So yeah, we took that same function and just have an arrow function setting it to false. And then really the only other thing is just we have not a logical AND operator here. Just if it's true, it'll show. If it's false, it won't show. And so, yeah, that's essentially, I think, everything to this.
Want to show the CSS just so people can see CSS?
Oh, sure. Yeah, so for the modal itself, I did it in this way where the background pretty much covers the whole screen, and so it lays on top. And so we use the z-index that to make sure it lays on top of the screen with kind of a little bit of an opaque black background to kind of separate it from the page. And then the content we have here with white that lays on top of that. And so I wasn't sure if this was the best way, like the VWVHs, but it seemed to work.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean,
so
that's great.
Yeah, and so that's essentially for the modal, and then for the for the button itself, it was essentially the same as the center one, but just to the right. And then hopefully I haven't tried it with Safari since I added this, but this was kind of what you recommended, adding this top property in there. And so it doesn't seem like it made it work. It didn't make any changes on mine. So hopefully that figured that out. And then I just, from a very small thing, I also added a little media query here because I noticed on the mobile it was too far centered, where now it's only 10 pixels on the phone. So,
right. Okay, cool.
So on its desktop, it's slightly wider. It looks a bit more natural. But, and yeah.
Nice. Good stuff.
Are there any other questions with that? Or?
I was just looking at on my phone. It looks great.
Okay. So Safari is.
I haven't tried it, yeah. So.
Awesome. Yeah, I just merged that into master and resolved the conflicts before the call. So that's all on there now.
Nice.
Awesome.
Okay, we'll go next, I guess. Do you mind sharing, Amber? Sorry, I didn't get a chance to tell you. Basically, I pulled it down, but the map center was not there. So I don't know what happened on my end, but.
Oh no, I think it was me, and I fixed it like right before we got here because I don't think I commented out all the idols, but I'll definitely share because I got it up on mine. Yeah, that was me. My bad.
Oh, you're fine. You're fine. Sorry, I was working yesterday, and then I was looking at it this morning, and I was just like, I'm getting nowhere here. So okay, that makes me feel less crazy. Thank you.
No problem. So I guess I could start here. I'll reload. So essentially what we got to working today or throughout the week was when you pan, it makes new pins, and it does it like with the default of Corrigan when you share. So, let me drag. It usually makes me use my fingers because I have a touch screen. But like here's the new center, and there it's auto-populating here.
Is that guy under the R616?
Yeah, I was just that guy.
I like. So what I love about this app is I'm like, oh, what's that? What's that? You know, I want to explore everything. Anyway.
Genuinely, like we got off the phone with you, and I think it was only about half an hour, and like I panned to the space card tool, which is like not that exciting of a place, but now I'm like, it's the most exciting place.
That's a beautiful place with all the attractions.
Right.
And I'll go ahead and share as well because I didn't think to do that. I assume it would work when you share.
I think it does, yeah.
Takes a second.
Hopefully it didn't break anything.
Yeah.
No console errors. I think it's just slow.
Taking a minute.
Mm-hmm.
Don't you think I should make that fall apart?
I think we'd see errors if it was a problem. Yeah, it's probably just taking a second.
While my computer's trying to figure its life out, let's look at the code.
Yeah.
So in this little function that we already had, that it's like it looks if the maps object, like the object that's generated from a successful shoot off, of the nearby API. If that's filled, then it runs this, which effectively catches when you pan. I grab the latitude and longitude from that by like going into get center. I could have made this simpler, but essentially grab the latitude and longitude from get center, and then after we change the user's pan to true in the state, I then just had the handle center change function use the new lat and long, and it really just has fetch nearby places in it, running this lat and long as opposed to the other lat and long. My idea behind that was with the welcome screen, and this might just not even be a thing, but it was like instead of revert, it would just have like what you already had stored to revert back to. So I didn't want to save over your shared location and state, which it saves like map properties. So instead of like whatever we end up doing for welcome screen, we just grab map properties to shoot off on reload when you click, as opposed to like we had before, where when you go to reload, you have your cork again instead of your location.
Yeah. Yeah.
I don't know if it loaded. Ah, yes. Here I
There we
am. And there's where I panned.
Ooh.
Beautiful. Sorry, I moved my fingers.
Anything cool
maybe
around
not.
where you are?
Around me, it's mostly like Civil War stuff.
Oh, really? Oh, interesting. Nice.
Because I'm near like Petersburg, Virginia. It's
Uh-huh.
a major battle site during the Civil War and Revolutionary War. So it's like Turn and Lincoln, like anything from those two specific time periods. I've done a lot of filming around in this area.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. But yeah, that's pretty much it for this end. And then Ashley took more of a lead on the welcome screen user story.
Yeah. We haven't properly figured that out yet. We kind of did exactly what it said on the tin for that one, and that was kind of wrong. So we need to fix that. But we essentially have it built. But
yeah.
Just need
All right. Very cool. It's like a fun, like usable app already. It's great. It's really cool.
Yeah, I love how quickly it became usable. Yeah.
Yeah, I like those shopping lists where like it takes a little while to get that thing to be to a point where you can actually do anything with it, right? Nice, very good. Cool. Well, let's do the learning module, and then we'll talk about sort of what the work that's coming up. So, all right. There's my screen. So story splitting. Yeah. All right. Anyway, so just to make sure we kind of all have the same kind of context around this, this is kind of a wall of words, but I'll walk you through it. So a story in this context is it's a description of some improvement to your product or site, usually written from the user's perspective. So as an example, as a user, I want to pan around a map and see pins marking places of interest, right? Like that's something a user would come to your app and want to do. And a story describes some piece of the functionality of what the app will do. So a story, can also be thought of as like a unit of work. And that applies to both Scrum and Kanban, which are probably the two most commonly used agile methodologies in software development. I won't spend a ton of time on the differences between those two because this kind of applies to both of them. So, but in Scrum, teams assign story points to kind of try to estimate relative complexity of stories. And in Kanban, the idea is that you try to right-size stories. You try to get stories to all fall into a predictable sort of agreed upon range. So like my team at work, what we shoot for is 3 days. If a story fits into 3 days, we're good. If it feels like it's gonna be 4 or 5 days or more, then we go through a process of splitting the story. So story splitting itself is the act of breaking down a big story into multiple smaller ones that achieve sort of the same intended result. So why does that keep coming back to that? So for example, as a user, I want to be able to manage my account on xyz.com. Manage my account is kind of a loaded thing. It's a big thing. So you could split that into probably more than just the following stories. I want to be able to log into xyz.com. I want to be able to reset my password. I want to be able to upload an avatar photo. I want to view past transactions on xyz.com. So it's kind of that, the process is that kind of like unpacking, like, what does that story actually mean? Oh, it actually means these several things. So let's actually break it into those things. And maybe some of those even have, things that they could be split into as well, right? So another example, which is maybe a little more familiar, is, the smart shopping list could have been one story. As a user, I want a shopping list that learns my habits. But that leaves a lot to the imagination. So, as a user, I want to be able to create a new list. As a user, I want to be able to add an item to my list. As a user, I want to be able to mark an item as purchased. As a user, I want to view list items in order of when I next need to buy them. And as you know from having built that app yourselves, even those things, some of those things were broken into finer grained stories. So, so sometimes the software teams they'll call the big stories epics. So we do this. We have epics and then stories are sometimes broken out into tasks. But epics are still stories. They're still written the same way. They're from the user's perspective. As a user, I want to be able to, manage my profile would be an epic, and each of those things under it would be a story. So it often kind of ends up, when you go through a story splitting exercise, as a tree of related stories, sort of like in this diagram here, where you have an epic at the top. Maybe you break it into 3 stories. One of those gets broken into 2. Another one gets broken into 2. One of those gets broken into 2. Right. So it's it's kind of an iterative process, I guess, is the point of all that. Cruising through these slides. Anyway, so what's the big deal, you might ask, about story splitting? Like, why would you do this? So there's this kind of mnemonic thing. This is sort of a, it's not a standard, but it's like, a lot of people who are kind of deep into Agile will think about stories in this way. They need to be independent. So one story shouldn't depend on another story, and the value of doing that is that you can then, if you decide that, story B is higher value than story A, you can switch the order of when you work on them, because they're not dependent on each other, right? They should be negotiable. So, if the product owner says, we need to do this thing, as a user, I want to do this thing, the team should be able to say, like, have a discussion about it. Like, you should be able to kind of decide together as a group. This is kind of an agile kind of a approach, is that the team organizes around, like, that is the right thing to be doing for the user, or maybe there's some more nuance to it, or something like that. It should be valuable, so it should provide some value to the stakeholder, which is, the stakeholder is usually end users, but in some cases, you might be building a part of a system that only talks to another part of a system, and that can be valuable as well. But usually you try to create a story that's what they call a vertical slice. So it's got maybe a database layer and a middleware layer and a UI, but all that stuff is in service of some kind of functionality for the end user. It should be estimatable, which is not an actual word, but that's what the industry uses for this part of it. So it needs to be unambiguous enough. It doesn't have to be completely unambiguous, but it has to be unambiguous enough that the team can estimate how long it will take to complete. Although even saying that, that's more of a Kanban thing than a Scrum thing. In a Scrum setting, it would be unambiguous enough to estimate its relative complexity to other work that the team has done. It needs to be small, so small enough. It doesn't have to be atomic. I mean, I don't know what that means exactly, but it needs to be small enough that you can sort of visualize the whole solution. So, it needs to be, I mean, I'm sure you've encountered problems in your work or your life where the problem is so big that you don't really have a handle on all the parts of it, right? When you're splitting stories, you want the problem to be small enough that you can kind of be like, okay, I understand the problem set, I understand the concerns involved, I can kind of visualize what the solution is, and if I do those things, it's going to solve this problem. You want these things to be kind of small enough to like hold in your head, I guess is one way to say it. And then you want the story to be testable. So what that means basically, it's not testing necessarily in like unit testing or functional testing or something like that. It just means that it needs to be verifiable, like, so you know when you're done. Like you need to be able to tell that you're done, right? So the kind of the distinction here is, if you'll know whether or not you're able to log into the system or not, right? Like that's something you can kind of verify, validate. If it's something like like a performance concern or something, or a scaling concern, like sometimes those things are really hard to know when you're actually done. They're kind of open-ended. You can always make the app perform better or scale better. So in general, stories you need to be all these things: independent, negotiable, valuable, estimatable, small, and testable. Now, there is some natural tension among these qualities. So, for example, by making stories smaller, a lot of times you end up introducing dependencies between them, so they're no longer independent. Okay, so like manage my account is sort of an independent thing. I mean, that's like a pretty high level story, but you can't do reset your password if you can't log in, right? Like, so as soon as you've broken those down, all of a sudden you need one before you can do the other one, right? So it introduces sort of complexity to the management of the project. But it's also probably worth it in some, in the sense of like, the team can only really do one of those things at a time anyway. So let's work on login first, and then we'll work on resetting the password, right? So there's no story that is absolutely perfect across all 6 of these characteristics. But what you strive to do is like get the best balance of all those things on any story that you're writing. All right. So Agile, like kind of at large, there's Scrum, Kanban, and XP are sort of the 3 most popular methodologies. Scrum is by far the most popular. Kanban is the next most popular. I've never actually worked in a place that used XP. Extreme programming is another, that's kind of the long form of that. But Agile, those are all Agile methodologies. Agile is designed to allow a team to deliver as much value as possible by focusing on the highest priority work. So the way it works in Scrum is the product owner keeps a backlog. The backlog is in an absolute priority rank. So the thing at the top of the backlog is the highest priority for the team. The second thing is the second highest priority, down to the last thing on the list. And by always working on the highest priority thing, the team is theoretically, delivering as much value as possible as fast as they can. And at some point, so in software, the last 20% of the work often takes 80% of the time, right? So you get through a lot of like the happy path, you get through, the bulk of the work, like all the kind of like the basic CRUD operations, all that stuff. And then you're like down to there's an article that I referred to a lot when I was making these slides, what the author calls the fiddly bits, where it's like a lot of like, you could spend, weeks and weeks trying to get these things right, but maybe there's not that much value to the end user in those things, right? So, so the whole point of this is that the smaller the story, the more flexibility the team has in deciding when the product's done. So if you have these big stories and, you're not done until you get all the big stories done, you're going to be there for a long time. And the business may be like, we're done, we want to move on. Whereas if you have small stories, you can kind of understand, like, we put them in priority order by how we think is like what we think is most valuable to the user. We've done 80% of them. These last 20%, like, do they even matter? Are they going to actually make a difference to the user's experience? And a lot of times the business will be like, nope, let's move on to the next project. So the whole idea of this is to kind of facilitate that conversation. And it's a sometimes, I mean, I'm a little bit of a perfectionist, and I like to have a lot of polish on the things that I build and like make it really good and all that kind of stuff. But when I step back and think about what is the business trying to achieve, a lot of times it is like that last 20%, probably not going to make a huge difference. It's going to satisfy my inner perfectionist, but it's not going to like make us more money or like keep us employed or anything, right? So, so that's kind of the why of story splitting. All right, let's get into the how. So, user goal decomposition is one way of kind of describing this. That's the process of taking a user goal and splitting it into sub goals. So this is the article that how to split user stories, which it was the first result in Google when I looked for this stuff, and I'm gonna send it to my team. I mean, I'm gonna make them all read it because it was so good. It's some of it might not make sense if you haven't worked in kind of a software setting yet, but eventually you're gonna be like, oh yeah, I see why that was a good article. Anyway, so there was a part of this where he talks about this user goal decomposition stuff, and the big takeaway was, oh man, all right, was like once you split this goal, so if the goal is to let the user register, and once you split it into, they enter their details and they submit their details. So this is a pretty common pattern of writing a story is, as an owner of unwanted stuff, I can register for the online auction website so that I can sell my unwanted stuff. Okay, so that's a certain format of user story. His big thing was that the I can from this goal becomes the so that of the sub goal. So now we have a new goal, which I can enter my registration details so that I can register for the online auction website. You register for the online auction website so that you can sell your unwanted stuff, right? Like, so you kind of are able to, as long as you're able to kind of keep breaking down these goals, you can write smaller and smaller stories if you kind of approach it like that. Does that make sense? Yeah. So what are some of the fault lines if we're trying to split a story? What are the fault lines that we can find to help us kind of split these things? So sometimes there are functional versus non-functional requirements. So I kind of mentioned this before, but a feature is a functional requirement. I need to be able to do something in the app. Performance is kind of a non-functional requirement. It's important, but there's a tendency among software people to sort of what we call prematurely optimize things. So, you may get through building all the features and realize that it's performant enough, or if it's not super performant, because the thing is built, you can like hone in on the one place in the app that's not performing well and fix that, as opposed to trying to make the whole thing performant the entire time you're building, which would just extend the project by a lot. So this is one fault line. If there are sort of performance related acceptance criteria in an otherwise functional story, that might be a place where like if you're going a story splitting session, you can see like, what, I think those things can be moved out to a separate story. They're non-functional requirements. We can maybe address those later. So that's the first fault line. The UI channel. So, tablet, mobile, desktop, or Windows, Mac, Smart TV. There's a few different, kind of, device or OS or whatever platform. Like those are sometimes places that you can split stories. Not in our case as much, but I mean, potentially, we actually, if we're, like we're building this thing basically in a desktop browser, but the target is a phone, right? So we probably, if we really intend this to be a mobile app, a phone app, we wouldn't probably spend a lot of time making it kind of optimizing it for desktop, right? So that's a place that we could like make a trade-off. All right, there. So user types. So sometimes that is sort of the role that the user plays within the software. Like my team is working on a new stack for the Zapier blog, and we have writers and editors. Those are a couple of different roles. So we might prioritize one role or the other when we're splitting stories. English speakers versus Spanish speakers might be another one. There are a bunch of different ways you can kind of think about your users, and potentially kind of make stories that are smaller in scope so you can address the most, like the people you most expect to use your product. The goal level. So this is a concept from that article too. So sort of summary goals versus user goals. So summary goals are sort of these higher order goals that I mean, it's this is probably where we would spend most of our time in splitting. It's that stuff that we were talking earlier about. You know, you have a goal, but that goal can be made up into sub goals that are a little bit more directly user facing or something. And then, yeah, so it's always a good place to split. So user flow. So there is, I think we've talked about the happy path before, or maybe in your previous cohort you did, where there's sort of the stuff you expect the user to do, you know, and like if it's a form and they put the right things in the form, it should work. But maybe you don't handle every edge case and every like error case. So, you know, if it's a field that's supposed to be all numbers and they put letters in there, you know, maybe you don't address that in the first story, but maybe there's a story later on where you come back and kind of take care of those edge cases. So the level of polish that you want to apply. So an example of that is, you know, maybe early on as you're building the product, you just have the user enter the date in a certain format or something into a field, but then, you know, later on it's a lot more scope to build a date picker, you know, or to integrate one. So maybe that's something that you come back to and do later. And then this kind of a concept of steps or skeletons. So a good example of that is what we just did, like make the modal appear, right? We didn't try to do everything about the modal in one go. We like make the modal appear, and then the next story is to add the UI to the modal that has the slider and all that stuff. Then the next step will be to hook that up to the actual routine that makes the calls to the API. So these are all different places where you can potentially split stories when you see them. Whew. All right. And then, so how far is too far? It's possible to take things too far. As a developer, I want to type the letter C so I can start the process of assigning a variable. That's taking it too far. So you're going to write CONST, but like you don't want a story for each letter, right? Like there are clearly limits to how far this should go. That's a ridiculous one, but some guidelines for that are when you're tempted to break a story down along functional or architectural lines. So this isn't as much of a concern for us because we're all kind of doing the same thing, but like on my team at work, you know, if we had a story and we wanted to say as a, you know, like we wanted to break it down to like back end and front end, like that's kind of a smell. Like it's probably not the right story at that point. Really what you want is something that's user facing, that's providing value, right? So not like, you know, I want to create a data, like as a user, I want a data model that holds this stuff. It's like, that's not user facing value. That's like a system implementation detail. And then it's possible, you know, when the story is so small that it doesn't provide actual user facing benefit, then it's probably too small as well. So the author of the article, he was like, you might, the original goal is like sell my stuff, you know, on like an auction site or something. That's really just a higher level goal, which is in turn a sub goal of a goal to like make some cash, which is in turn a sub goal of like buy food, which is a sub goal of feed my family, which is a sub goal of keep my family alive. And like you like kind of go on infinitely, right? And or lose yourself in this kind of philosophical, why are we even here eventually, you know? So there are limits kind of in both directions of, you know, like how you want to write your stories. And it's really what it's about is the team finding kind of what they're comfortable with, you know. In Kanban, you know, we agree as a team on how long a story, the average story should take. You know, so if it's 2 or 3 days or whatever it is, I mean, for us, it's like a few hours, right? You know, if we can get it done in 3 hours, 2 people working together for 3 hours, that's probably about right. It leaves you time to review, it leaves you time to merge, it leaves time for this call. So anyway, that's really what's important about it. So it takes a little bit of practice. It takes a little bit of trial and error sometimes, especially in Scrum. Like it takes teams a while to understand what a story point means, you know, like a 5 versus an 8. Like, you know, teams will like sit there and argue about what you know, 5 story points versus 8 story points, when really it's just a guess. And, you know, you should like decide what you think a 5 means, call it that, and then go back and measure it later and then refine as you go. That's sort of the agile approach to that. And then just some resources. So, so this is how to split user stories. These are, you know, when you search on how to split user stories, you get articles with some of the same titles. But anyways, this top one is the one that most of this presentation was based on, and it's a great article. The second resource, I didn't mention it really in the slides, but they describe a kind of an interesting technique of, 0, 1, and many. So, what should a shopping list look like when it has 0 items on it? What should a shopping list look like when it has 1 item on it? What should a shopping list look like when it has many items on it? So you can kind of go through that and use that to build up your stories. There's kind of an initial state of an app. A lot of times, like, developers will start building the app and they have data in there, so they kind of very quickly forget about that state where there's no data in the app, and then this kind of like this broken experience, right? And then this PDF is pretty interesting. I might actually open it. So it talks about, I wonder if I can zoom in on this. No, all right. So, kind of preparing the original story, but then it has a bunch of, like, when you go to split a story, a bunch of questions you can ask. Does the story contain multiple operations? Does it describe a workflow? Does it have a variety of business rules? Does the story do the same thing to different kinds of data? Does it have a complex interface? So all these questions you can ask as you're looking at a story in order to kind of know, and kind of give some guidelines about how to split it up. So yeah, some good resources in there. That was a lot, really fast. I'm just gonna throw the link in the chat, back in Slack. But I'd love to hear what questions that brings up for all of y'all.
No real questions. That was really helpful. There was one thing when me and Jen were working earlier in the week, and I was talking about how I really wanted to make the modal more accessible. Like when you click the button, it automatically focuses on the modal. So if you click escape, then it'll close. And she kind of mentioned, like, maybe that would be another story for later on, like, to come back to. And so yeah, that would just be, I think, an example of story splitting. Obviously, which, if we can get the accessible stuff the first time, but maybe that could be like something additional. And yeah, so it's just one thing.
That's a really good example to bring up, because it's theoretically it's this kind of functional versus non-functional requirement, but it's it kind of depends on the user's perspective. Like, if the user is using a screen reader, it's absolutely a functional requirement, right? And so this is actually, I think, where a lot of tension comes in on development teams, and like between them and the product owners, or if there's somebody who's just passionate about accessibility, is that the product owner is thinking in terms of, like, 95% of my users are not on screen readers, so let's just get this thing done and kind of keep moving. And some, like, there's that 5% who are on screen readers who are just not going to be able to use the thing, or it's going to be really clunky for them to use it. So for them, it is a functional requirement. So it's a great example. I think it's, I understand why businesses don't prioritize accessibility, but man, I wish they did. But you're right. Like, in the story that you were working on, accessibility wasn't specified as that it should be accessible to a screen reader. It wasn't specified. So, as you're, from the perspective of you as a developer, be like, yeah, I mean, it wasn't specified, so we didn't do that part of it, but we should make a ticket and come back to it, and then maybe it doesn't happen. You know what I mean? Like, it's so a lot of times there's kind of this, like, guerrilla movement within the company to do accessibility, like, from the grassroots, from the developer level, where it's, like, I'm going to spend a little bit of extra time and make this thing accessible as just, like, in the course of business, so but it puts a lot of onus on the developer to kind of learn even how to tell whether something's accessible or not, to kind of learn the best practices for implementing that kind of stuff and everything. But that's how it tends to play out.
Would you say story splitting happens, like, after the MVP has been decided on? Or does story splitting happen like also when you have stretch goals that you want to incorporate into your stories as well? Or what does the whole
Mhm.
flow
Yeah.
of that look like?
That's a great question too. Usually the course of a project is that there's some, you want to build something, kind of you have a sort of an end state, a rough end state in mind, and you start creating stories that get you to that thing. And then you take that initial set of stories and you prioritize them. So, a lot of times it's, you need to be able to create an account, is like one of the first things usually. And so whatever that top priority thing is, the team, like they encounter that story and then they go through kind of a grooming exercise of taking that story and breaking it down into smaller stories. So there's, in that same article, the author describes sort of the stuff at the top of your backlog is going to be finer grained and more detailed than the stuff at the bottom of the backlog. And that's actually a really good thing, because it means like some of that stuff at the bottom of the backlog, you're never going to do. Like there's going to be stuff that you ship, you move on, and there's going to be, the bottom 10 or 20% of things that you thought you wanted that turned out not to be that important, and you move on. And so you didn't waste time, kind of trying to break all those things down too. Like it wouldn't be very fruitful to take the entire backlog of the initial stories and try to break them all down into the optimal stories in advance, right? Like you kind of take them as they come, and then the whole Agile, the whole thing around Agile is like, as you're building it, you are learning what the user actually needs, because you're building the highest priority thing. You are ideally having actual users use the software and encounter it and kind of give feedback, and then they're maybe asking for things or like saying like, oh, that's not useful. And so you kind of learn as you go. And so by the time you get to the end, sometimes the product's doesn't resemble very much like what you thought you were going to be building. So that's kind of how it usually goes. You start off with course stories and you kind of groom, a couple of weeks ahead in terms of what the work is. Should we try a little bit of this? Maybe look at a couple stories.
Sure, sounds good.
All right. We don't have a ton of stories left, so.
That's crazy. I didn't know there were so few left.
Yeah, because I was only able to come up with, I think, 13 when I first did it, and then I came up with this 14th that I haven't actually implemented on my app. But what week are we in? So
We have 3 weeks left.
3 weeks.
Oh, really? Oh, okay. So that's not bad.
Might have made that up.
Yeah.
Sounds right. Feels
I think
right.
that's right. 1, 2. Yeah, I think you're right. So 1, 2, 3 Sundays from now we'll be done.
Nice.
So we have a couple things in progress, and then it feels about right. Maybe some of these do split into smaller stories. So this is a candidate for that, because this is actually, I don't know, I found this to be fairly complicated. So add fetch delay to slider settings. Oh no, this is actually just adding it to the UI, right? Yeah. So there's another one that's actually using those values. But anyway, so this one, the AC is on the settings modal, which is now implemented. We should display a range input slider with values ranging from 0 to 30 in steps of 5. Above the slider should be some texts explaining what it controls. So, the example is set how frequently the app will fetch and replaces. Values are in seconds. Above the slider should display icons or emoji above the values. And you could decide to do this differently, but I had 0, 15, and 30 just as kind of examples. So, and that have them sort of convey the use case for each of the different values. So, if you're driving, if you're on a bike, if you're walking, just kind of give users a sense of like, how is it going to affect the experience of the app. The default value of the slider should be 15. When the user changes the value, it should be saved to local storage. So is there are there any ways that you can think of to, like, I mean, first of all, I guess there's no point breaking it down if we feel like this fits into our criteria of, or our kind of maximum of, was like 6 person hours, right? Like 3 hours each from a pair of people. So do we feel like we can get that done within that time? I'm gonna have a little wine while y'all think about that.
I think so.
Yeah, the only one that stood out at me at the go was the last one. But if we're just saving it and then not doing anything with it, I guess that's not too much more work. But that was the only thing that's kind of different from like a basic UI implementation.
Yeah, so basically as you drag this, whatever the new value is of the slider, it should just be saved to local storage.
Okay.
Have you all worked with range inputs before?
No.
No, that's what makes me hesitate. Like it
Yeah.
sounds like it sounds accessible, but it's like if you're unfamiliar, 3
Yeah,
hours.
there's a default sort of range input. Let's see, W3 schools. So there is an input type equals range,
Oh, right.
which gives you a UI, and you can, and it has attributes, min and max, and step is the other one that you can actually add that in. So,
Oh, perfect.
and we can change this to 30. And all of a sudden, we have something that's pretty close. Like actually in I guess the default is in the middle, so you wouldn't even have to set the default necessarily. And now it's like 0 to 30 is steps of 5. So that just getting a basic range input is pretty simple. To get one that looks fancy like this is a bit more scope. So I used, what did I use? Actually, that's not the right place to go. I used this thing from, I think the developer works at Zillow, and he published a React range component that's a lot easier to style, basically. Is the whole point of it. So that's what I used when I did this. That still took a little bit of research and figuring out and that kind of thing. So there's a quick way to do this. So this is maybe a place where we could, oops, where are my slides? Like level of polish is maybe a place where we can decide to split this story, right? So come on. Because the basic range input like this isn't super polished, but it works fine, and as you can see, it's like one line of HTML. To get it to look like this, you might need to use that external package and kind of figure out what the API is and how to style it and all that kind of stuff. So that's a place to fetch it. I mean, it's or to split it. So, but the ACE doesn't actually specify that the slider itself has to look like this at all. So you could go with the basic range input, and if we, and then, 2 weeks from now we're like, oh, we have a little bit of extra time, we can go back and implement a fancier one. That would be totally acceptable. So do you feel like this one is appropriately scoped then?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think so.
I think definitely when you kind of break it, like I wouldn't have known about that HTML concept, and it probably would have taken me 2 days to find that. So I think that's like helpful, in the stories. Just having a bit more conversation at the start of the week makes it less daunting, I guess.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because you see this and you're like, I've never seen anything like that before.
Yeah.
That's fancy and slick. Yeah. So
Exactly. Yeah.
mm-hmm. All right, so we'll not split this one. Let me just leave a comment. Cool. So that's a really good grooming outcome, is that the team, we've looked at it, we think it is well scoped. as long as we take this approach, right? That's a super valid way to approach that. So cool. All right. Let's see. Add videos to walk users through adding the app to their home screen. So I think we've looked at this before, but it's these videos. So in the footer should appear some help text prompting the user to add the app to their home screen. So here it says, what's near me looks and works best when installed on your phone as an app. Then how to for iOS and how to for Android. When the user taps on one of the links, it should open, well, actually I have here, it should open a modal. And I think that was actually just to kind of save y'all some scope. So it should open a modal, which we already have a way to do that, right? So, but it means that we're going to have a modal that can take different content than what the current modal takes. The alternative would be to try to do what I did here, which is, kind of, change the viewport a little bit so the video fits. Use this kind of details element and that kind of thing. So we can, either way would be totally fine with me. And then in the modal, a video should play that shows a user adding the app to their home screen. And those videos, you can just use the ones that they're in the repo already. So you can just link to those videos. So there'll be some, kind of, like you might have to, I know every time I do a video tag, I have to look up what the parameters are for the video tag, how to format it and stuff. So there'd be a little bit of research there. What do you feel like is the lower scope approach? Is it the modal, or is it this kind of animating the viewport thing?
I'd say the modal, but that's only because I've done modals before.
Oh, that's valid. Yeah.
Yeah, I'd agree with that.
Okay, so if we take the approach of it being a modal, do we feel like this is in that 6 person hour window?
Yes.
It might be less if it's a modal, just because we've already built a modal. So like you could theoretically utilize the same code, just readjust it to render something else.
Yeah, I guess that it might depend a little bit on whether you want to reuse the modal that's there and feed it different content. So maybe the modal needs to have like a concept of rendering its children or something, and you pass different stuff into it based on
or there's like a
clicked.
parameter where you like conditionally render depending on what you tell it to render, I guess.
Yeah, we did that in the shopping list. Delete and the information one.
Yeah, I think this one's pretty appropriate, if not less, if we utilize the same code.
Cool. Yeah. If you had to recreate those videos.
If we had to make our own videos, then yeah, it would take a while.
That was a hassle. All right, cool. Well, that sounds good. All right. And then, okay. So here, this just has one AC. It seems so simple. But use the delay slider setting to control frequency of place fetches. So we set things up so that the app wouldn't try to fetch new places again before the previous call had completed, right? And then, so this kind of extends that. So the app should wait to fetch new places for the number of seconds the user has set in the delay slider. So actually that's not very well worded. What that really means is whatever number of seconds they've set, it should wait until after it completes plus that number of seconds. Does that make sense? So
that kind of be like a timeout type thing, or?
Yeah, I mean, there are there are probably, yes, I mean, a set timeout is probably the right way to go about that. But yeah, that way, if the user has it set to 0, like that's a setting that they can choose, we're not going to be fetching them all the time. We're going to be waiting until one completes, then we're going to make the next one right away with no delay. But if they have it set to 30 seconds, but one completes and then it waits 30 seconds and then it makes the next call, right? So let me actually edit that. Wait to fetch in new places.
So would you do something like adding a set timeout in another like .then, so that it waits after it's resolved and then starts again or something like that? Because then it completely times out the use effect for that amount of time, I guess.
Something like that. Because the thing is, like, you don't necessarily need to be making calls every 30 seconds if it's 30 seconds. You only need to be making them, you need to make sure you're not making them more frequently than 30 seconds.
Well, my
Right.
thinking is that if you set a set timeout after the promise has resolved, so then it waits for at least that long before it checks again whether or not you're running a promise or not, right?
Oh, so the thing that's controlling whether the app's able to make a call is whether there's a promise pending, right? So what you're saying is you don't set the promise back to not
I think because we
pending.
set it to a local state in the app. It
Yeah, so you just
then,
you would do a set timeout with the user's set delay instead of just calling that thing directly when it's done, right?
Yeah, because, well, I'm not sure exactly how use effect works, but I know if we put in the array the things that it's dependent on to run again, if we put a set timeout on it, then will it just not run again for 30 seconds, even though we don't do anything after the set timeout? Does that make sense?
Kinda. Someone help me navigate to where that stuff is. It's in components, and is it in map?
Yeah, but I think anyways, you recommended that we just save the promise anyways and check the state. So that might even resolve that issue as well.
If it's not in there, it might be in the main app. On the app component, I mean.
Well, anyway, I think we have some good ideas about how we might be able to solve it. How does it feel in terms of scope?
Might be some pitfalls or like some weird things that might happen with the story where it's one of those that looks straightforward, but it is not.
Yeah, it might. Like, if you get lucky, you might go straight to it, and you're like, "Oh, that took half an hour." But it might be hard to test, or you might, you go down the wrong path at first. You might kind of go down a rabbit hole, right? So it does seem like it's a little bit risky, maybe.
Yeah, this is a more I don't know how. Yeah, risky or gambling kind of. It depends on your luck of the day.
Yeah, go ahead.
I was saying this would require getting the information from the local storage, correct? That's where we saved the seconds. Yeah,
I know we used a package in the last cohort. Do you remember what the package was named, Aisling? But we used a package to save things to local storage. It's just like a simple npm package.
Was it local forage?
No.
No? Oh, that's a nice one, because local storage is a synchronous operation. So you're writing to the file system, reading from the file system, and nothing else can happen while that's going on. So in a case where it's a little value like this, it doesn't take any time at all. But if you were reading and writing like big
A lot.
pieces of data, like it would lock up the UI. So local forage is actually asynchronous. So it uses IndexedDB.
Nice.
If that's not available, it falls back to local storage, but it gives you the same API. So
You mind dropping that link in this issue, maybe, to local storage?
local forage. See, that's an example of where I would say we would split along. Where's my stuff? That's like a functional versus non-functional requirement kind of split, right? Where we can get it done in local storage. If it turned out to be a problem, we would have a follow-up story that would be like a performance related story. But I would definitely drop a link to local forage in the chat.
Okay.
But that wasn't what you were thinking of. You used some other package.
Let me try to. I think I literally just went to npm and typed in local storage and see what came up, and I think we used the first one. Yeah, I think it's just called local dash storage. Or let's see. Yeah, I believe it was just called local storage is the one that we used.
Mm-hmm.
But it looks like there's a lot of them, so.
And really local storage, like you could keep this value, the user moves the slider around and you just keep it in memory somewhere, right? Like you keep it in a variable somewhere. The purpose of putting it in local storage is that if the user comes back to the app later, they reload the app or something, they're going to have the same setting. It's going to persist between sessions. So that's actually, now that I say that out loud, that's a place where you could split the story. Or maybe split the previous story of saving that value. It doesn't have a lot of scope to add it to save to local storage, but it's a little bit of scope. I mean, we felt like the story was within our range anyway. So, but
Or I wonder if there could be an extra story that says like makes it so that the user can store their previous settings, because all of these things like can be stored in React state, and then like you would then have a subsequent story to like move it all to local storage.
Yeah, that's actually a good point. So so we pull this one out, I guess, and create a separate one where the story is that as a user, I want my settings to persist from one session to the next, maybe.
Yeah, I think that might be good.
I mean, I guess we can argue about what the priority is. Actually, that second AC, I guess, though, is it just something you read into memory when the app loads, maybe? So you wouldn't necessarily have to read local storage every time you make a fetch. You know what I mean? Oh, see you, Jen. You have to go. All right. Happy graduation. So I don't know. I'll write something and we can refine it maybe when it comes up. Let's put it this way. Pretty rough, but you'll get the idea. Oh, I don't know why it's referring to this other. Is that? Oh, that's your. You have a PR open. PR 15 is opening. So, all right. Take that, GitHub. All right. Put that down at the bottom. Let's see. So we were talking about 12. So anything else on 12? Or we feel otherwise pretty good about that one? Yep. So 13, make the app a well-behaved PWA. PWA stands for Progressive Web App. We get some of this stuff out of the box from Create React App. It's pretty specific. So the title element in the index.html should be updated to match the app name. The public manifest.json should have the app name and a short name, which can be the same because this is a pretty short name. And then update the favicon and these kind of logo images to anything else besides the default React icon. So it's pretty rote. I feel like that's something doable within our agreed upon range.
Yeah, I mean that seems probably pretty almost too quick.
Yeah, pretty straightforward.
Yeah, pretty small, right?
Yeah,
So,
but it's good for Kanban where you can just grab one and get it filled, grab the next.
For sure. All right, cool. Then the last one is allow a user to search for a location. So I don't even know what this is going to take exactly. This is probably one where that's ripe for being split up. So we need to find somewhere to put a search field, or a search icon. Tapping on the search icon would bring up a text field that has focus, and a search button next to it. I don't actually know if that's necessarily the right thing. So typing a place name or address should autocomplete. If we have autocomplete, like the way that usually works is you're typing something in and it has a list of things underneath it, right? So potentially the user could just tap on one of those things instead of hitting search. So maybe the search button is not actually necessary. Hitting enter, return, or tapping search should center the map on the best matched location. If no location is found, alert the user. How does that one feel to people?
I feel like this one could potentially be split between UI and the actual function.
Yeah.
Yeah, the function being by itself seems like it'd be a better move.
Yeah. When you
Yeah, I
say
think
alert,
that's.
are you saying actually an alert pops up? Is that what you did?
I haven't implemented this myself.
Oh, okay.
We're breaking new ground here.
Okay.
I'm trying to think about these icons. Like one idea, it'd be weird to have one icon on one side and two icons on the other, right?
Yeah.
But maybe the thing to do would be to have the title on one side and three icons on the other, maybe? Would that be weird?
Sounds less weird, at least.
Yeah, it does sound less weird. And then, if you hit the icon, you could have a little field drop down right below the title, maybe. Or even it could actually take over the title. That's something we do on Zapier is you hit search and kind of everything else goes away besides the search,
Yeah.
Like a mini modal type thing? Or like it just wipes out where you clicked?
Yeah, it just replaces the nav with a search bar.
Oh, nice. Okay.
And then you could have the search results sort of drop down below it. And I think Google has in Google they have like a search API that'll autocomplete for you. So that stuff might be pretty canned. It might not. I mean, it would be a matter of kind of finding it and understanding the API and stuff. Like you shouldn't have to implement your own autocomplete for place names.
Yeah, I'm just looking at it on Google here. It's kind of in the footer if you like, but
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if you can see it.
So maybe let's keep that in mind. I mean, we'll see how we go over the next couple of weeks, and if we're getting close to needing to do this one, we'll maybe consider splitting it up. Does that work for people?
Yeah.
Right.
Sounds good.
Okay, cool. But yeah, those are good ideas. All right. Cool. Yeah. This one should not be closed, right? I think Jen said that.
My only thought, just sorry to go back to that one real
Sure.
quick. If we replace the header, like the name of the app, we're temporarily kind of disabling the other function that the app has about like resetting the footer. There'd be something to consider if we did that.
Yeah, actually, that's a good point. Like we would need some way for the user to cancel out of the search to get back to the state where they can hit that link, right?
Mm.
I like it otherwise, though.
Yeah, me too. Could we put it into the settings modal, or would that be totally?
I don't know how intuitive that would be.
Yeah.
But yeah, I agree. The phone's so small that once you start throwing 3 things up there, it gets a little crowded.
Yeah, to me, yeah, putting it in a modal would disconnect it from the effect it's having in a way,
Yeah. Yeah,
Yeah, that makes sense.
it's an extra step to get there.
Mhm.
I think that.
Okay, I mean, yeah, this does absolutely seem like this is a big enough one that we could split it up. But there's also a chance that these other stories take us the rest of the way through the 3 weeks. So we'll see how we go. If we get close, we'll to the needing to split that up, we'll do it. But
Cool.
Yeah, good. Hopefully that was helpful. The whole story splitting thing. I feel like y'all are gonna get on your first dev team and be like, that story's too big. We need to split it. Here's some strategies.
It was definitely helpful. It's always good to like remind yourself to kind of always break things into bite-sized pieces, because like you said, it's easy to get lost in the sauce, so to speak.
Yeah, and small stories make for small PRs, which are easy for people to review. There's a bunch of benefits. I probably should have put that in my slide deck, but
No, it's good. It's something I also want to do just with my own projects, is like create more stories instead of just like going in it and organize it as if it was a team project, an actual professional thing.
Oh, that would be nice.
Yeah,
just to get the practice at least. I feel like it'd be more efficient that way too.
Yeah, when I was building the app myself, I wasn't super disciplined about that, but I was like, oh, I should really write PRs, because if I want to make this into an app that other people build, like I need to leave myself some breadcrumbs. So when I was writing these stories, I was going back through all my commits and all my PRs and seeing like what are kind of the chunks of functionality that I put in, and so that's how I kind of created the project. Yep. Cool. All right. Well, good work as always, of course. Y'all are stellar. Love working with you. But we'll see you in Slack. Let me know if you have any questions about the stuff you're working on.
Okay.
Will do.
All right. Cool. All right. Take care.
Thanks a minute.
Yep.
Bye.
See you later.
Hey, you guys.